Talk Real Estate with Fred Johnson. With over 30 years of professional experience serving Central Oregon, Fred Johnson can help guide you through the Central Oregon real estate landscape. Call in at 541-388-1110. Talk Real Estate with Fred Johnson is brought to you in part by the Central Oregon Association of Realtors, Evergreen Home Loans, Abijay Automated Control Systems, and Duke Warner Realty. The phone number again is 541-388-1110. Now, Talk Real Estate, only on FM News 100.1 and News Talk 1110 KBND.
Hello, Central Oregon. Hello, Central Oregon, and welcome to Talk Real Estate with Fred Johnson. I'm your host, and we're here on another beautiful day. We have a little bit of smoke. We've got some fires all around us, it sounds like, today. The road, if you're headed to Portland, you're going to have to reroute yourself on the way to Portland because the highway is closed going through the Warm Springs Reservation. So we've got a number of things happening here in town, not the least of which is the Bend Brew Fest. So according to the newspaper, here we are in a town with only 80,000 folks. And we're going to anticipate 40,000 folks are going to go visit the Bend Brew Fest this weekend. So I don't know if anybody's out there listening to my show today, but we're hopeful that you're with us, and we're really excited. Today we have Nate Pedersen in with us. He's going to share a little history. Nate, are you with us over there on your microphone?
I am here. Thanks for having me on the show today, Fred.
Oh, thanks so much for being here today. We'll cover a couple of things here in the first segment of real estate note and interest, and then after that we'll be able to share some of the things that Nate is going to come in and tell us the story of of Klondike Kate. Nate is a community librarian with the Deschutes Public Library, as well as the president of the board of directors with the Deschutes Historical Society. So he's put together some really interesting and innovative talk. Basically came up with a talk initially for the history talk with the pub talk downtown, and it's grown into quite an interest because Kate is a very key part of our history here in Central Oregon, and we're looking forward to sharing some of that information. So first off, a couple of things came out this week in the newspaper that I think that are noteworthy. Those of you that are regular listeners realize that over the last couple of weeks I've talked about technology in Bend, Bend Tech, innovation environment, the number of startups that we have, and what a opportunity that has to sort of diversify our economy a little bit here in Central Oregon. And this week you may have noted that one of those startups, G5, received a $76 million private investment this week to improve their marketing cloud. And G5 has 30 employees here in Bend, and they're looking to grow that a little bit according to the economic development of Central Oregon. And we're really quite excited to see that level of activity. And as many of you can appreciate, $75 million is far more money than the city of Bend is going to give to affordable housing here in Bend. So we'll be able to talk to that a little bit in a minute as well. Another interesting thing came up is in commercial real estate, we're starting to see a little bit more vacancy in commercial real estate. And so as you're driving around town and you're seeing some of those for lease signs, that doesn't mean that our economy or our office space is not available. It's indicative of a problem. It's sort of typical market fluctuation. Businesses expand and contract even in a healthy economy. But one of the things that Eric Schultz over at Compass Commercial said this week is that we're going to see a dramatic increase over the next 12 months in those rental rates for those properties, due in fact because there hasn't been an awful lot of new construction built in recent years. So what that means is because of scarcity, those rates are going to start going up. However, right behind that, we're seeing a number of permits are being pulled, such as over this last fiscal year, 2014-2015, we went up to 610 permits as opposed to 467 permits for the prior year. So we will have not only more inventory, but also in that commercial area. One of the things that I've mentioned earlier on the show is the proposed solar farms. There's also some implications in the exclusive farm use zone on the properties, whether they can do events like using the farmland for weddings and that sort of thing. That too is sort of it makes these test cases for the exclusive farm use, and it's happening right here in Central Oregon, which is quite interesting. And also, excuse my dig to the city of Bend, but the city of Bend did, in fact, vote in this week that they would participate in a waiver of some of the systems development fees toward eligible projects, which would, in the rental properties, would mean that the people could not be making more than 60% of the median income, and for purchases it'd be 80% of the median income. This will affect about 50 properties a year over the next couple years, and it's certainly movement in the right direction. I know that I'm just bouncing through this information on the real estate stats and information. I guess that the word of the day would be stability. Basically, what we're seeing is where in the beginning of the year it was a bit of a frenzied state. We heard a lot of talk about multiple offers, and there wasn't enough inventory to meet the need coming out of winter. But since that time, we've had 7-8 months of construction. There's a lot of new construction coming in. So what we're starting to see in Bend is that there's more inventory, and the inventory is sort of outpacing the pendings and the purchases. So what that means is that it stabilizes the market sort of straight across the board. It doesn't allow the existing homes to really spike in value, and it holds the new construction a little bit more accountable because there's more competition, and as people enter the market, they have more comparables to make. So it sort of holds everything in value. So even though there is a lot of construction going on around town, the market's really stable, and as I tell you each and every time, this is really a great time. If you're giving some consideration, there's a fair amount of inventory. Money's still very, very reasonable, and if you can qualify for financing, now may certainly be a good time to give that serious consideration. So much for the stats and that. But again, once again, what we're seeing is an increase in inventory. We're also seeing an increase in building permits, both in the city of Bend as well as the city of Redmond. And that means that there's going to be additional inventory forthcoming. And one of the other things that kind of stepped out here was that, this last month in the city of Bend, we had nearly 250 sales. We were down just a little bit from the June sales of 297. But of those sales, only 21 of those sales were above $600,000. I realize that most of my listeners aren't in that higher end of the market, or not everybody's in that higher end of the market, but there's sort of that perception that the high end of the market is dominating and is pricing everybody out. And when in Redmond, absolutely no homes sold in the last month in that same price range. There were only 4 homes that sold between 5 and 6 in Redmond. But the vast majority of the market is in that $350 and under price point here in Central Oregon. So I don't think that they're going to set us all out on the curb anytime soon. But the market, all in all, is really quite stable. And I think that between, my message here this first quarter is between the diversity of our economy and our city fathers stepping up to address the affordable housing issue and some stability in the marketplace, it really looks quite good here in Bend, and I think that it's really kind of fun. And if you don't think it's fun, go down to the Brewfest and spend a few hours down there with 40,000 of your best friends, and it could be fun for you too. So when we come back, again, I want to introduce Nate Pedersen, and I'm going to give you Nate Pedersen's contact information a couple of times because he spells his last name Pedersen. So when you go to NatePedersen.com, that's a great way to be able to contact him, to be able to see some of the information. He did a pub talk this last year, and I think that you can access some information there. And you may find it really, really quite engaging. And when we come back after the break, I will share that information with you as well. Just getting ready to go into the break. And my phone number here at the station is 541-388-1110. And feel free to call in anytime. I think that did I get everything there, Nate? Did I get the information correct?
Yep, that all sounds good.
Perfect. So when we come back, what we'll do is we'll talk a little bit about Klondike Kate, who she was, how she found her way to Central Oregon, and then what she did in our community, and how her legacy continues to live on, and how that's going to go forward into the future. So when we come back after the break, we'll talk about Klondike Kate. Again, you're listening to Talk Radio with Fred Johnson, and we'll see you after the break.
You're listening to Talk Real Estate with Fred Johnson.
Hello there, Central Oregon. Welcome back. We're Talk Real Estate with Fred Johnson. I'm your host here at the station. Our phone number is 541-388-1110, or you can always contact me direct at Fred Johnson, or Fred at DukeWarner.com. Let me see here. I think I got a call coming in. Let's see if we can get that.
Hello.
Hello, are you on the line?
I'm on the line, Fred. I've been listening to you.
Oh, thank you. Who is this?
This is Linda.
Oh, Linda, how are you this week?
Quite well, thank you. I'm good. Say, I just had one little comment, and that was you were bouncing along with a lot of bullets about what was happening here in Bend and all of this, and I really appreciated that format. It kept my attention. It held my attention. It was good talk radio, and I want to compliment you on it.
Oh, Linda, I always appreciate your call, and thank you so much for that. It's that feedback that makes... I looked at Nate here, and I said, was I talking too fast? And
no, it was good.
Well, I appreciate that, and it's nice to see a good, healthy market here in Central Oregon, isn't it?
Yes, it really is. It's nice to feel uplifted and see people happy. I was talking to some people recently, and they said that they come back here for 3 months every year.
Uh-huh.
And I said, why do you come back? And she said, everyone is so happy here.
Oh, nice.
That's what I thought.
Well, I think there's a bunch of happy people down there at the Brewfest, so you might want to get down there.
No, it's not my style.
Well, it's not mine either. Well, Linda, thanks so much for the call in. I really appreciate it. I'm going to get with Nate here and listen up. You might learn a thing or two about Klondike Kate, one of our real characters in Bend history.
I intend to.
Right on. Thanks so much for the call in. Bye-bye now. Nate, how are you here today?
I'm doing good. Thanks again for having me on the show.
Oh, not a problem at all. Again, this is Nate Pedersen, and his last name is spelled Pedersen, so you can contact him at natepedersen.com. He's a community librarian with the Deschutes Public Library, as well as president of the board of directors with the Deschutes Historical Society. So, Nate, maybe you could maybe bring us a little bit of a background on Klondike Kate.
Absolutely, one of Ben's famous residents, and she was actually on KBND in the mid-'50s at one point as well, so it's a real treat to be here in the studio today talking about Kate on KBND. So Kate was born in 1876 in Kansas, small town in Kansas, and shortly after her birth, her mother and father began divorce proceedings. During those divorce proceedings, her mother fell in love with the divorce lawyer. And
no kidding.
So they ran off together and took Kate with them and left Kansas behind and came out west. And initially they went to Spokane Falls. Spokane was known at that point in history. This is the late 1800s. And they lived in a grand Victorian house there where Kate grew up in luxury and in style. Her stepfather was a circuit judge and a sort of colorful and boisterous personality in Spokane Falls. And his personality influenced Kate quite a bit since he was a gregarious character and he liked to dress to the nines and sort of be a known person in town. And that influenced Kate quite a bit as she was growing up there. She would do kind of funny things, like she would skip school pretty regularly. She was a hard one to keep in school. She was always bouncing and running around, and she would gather together a bunch of people, a bunch of her friends, and they'd all skip school together. But before they went down to have a picnic on the river, they'd stop by the local grocers and they'd get a whole bunch of food and a whole bunch of drinks, and they'd charge it all to her stepfather's account. And then, Kate never really cared much about money, about spending money, whether it was her money or someone else's. And one time in Spokane Falls, there was a major fire as well. This also kind of demonstrates Kate's early character. And she went around town and invited everyone that was newly made homeless from that fire to come and stay at her house. She figured, we've got this big house, we got a lot of empty space, we might as well fill it up with some cots. And if you're, her stepfather's this local judge, and if your daughter's going around saying that to everyone in town, you can't really say no when suddenly 30, 40 people show up at your front door asking to spend the night. So for a few weeks in Spokane there, a lot of residents were sleeping on cots and on porches around her house.
And I know that you'll go into this later, but maybe that's where her affinity for firemen may have come from that time in her life.
Right, yeah, and exactly. And later on in the show, we'll talk about her relationship with the Bend Fire Department. But after growing up in Spokane, eventually her mother divorced her stepfather, and they took to the road, and they actually ended up for a little while down in Chile, in Valparaiso, Chile.
Wow.
Hung out there for a while, and then after that went on to New York City. And in New York City, Kate sort of became a vaudeville dancer. That's where she first was introduced to that lifestyle. Her mother and her were pretty much out of cash by the time they showed up in New York City, and her mother took a low-level job in a shirt factory, and Kate tried to figure out a way to contribute to the family income. And she was about 18 years old at the time, and she saw an advertisement, a classified ad for Chorus Girls Wanted, no experience necessary, at a Coney Island theater. And she thought, that's perfect, that's my career right there, I want to do that. So she showed up at the Coney Island theater, hired on the spot, and spent a really lovely summer when Coney Island was just full of life, full of people from all walks of life at that point in time. This is about the turn of the century in New York City. And so you had money barons that would go on vacation there. You also had con men and middle-class vacationers, and it's quite a milieu, quite a social milieu in Coney Island. So she learned how to dance there. She learned how to sing. And when that job came to an end at the end of the tourist season, at the end of the summer, restlessness sort of rose up in her spirit. She was always kind of a restless wanderer. She spent a lot of time on the road, and she decided to head back west again. So her mother stayed for a little while in New York City, and Kate came back out west, came back out to Spokane, where she took a job vaudeville dancing there, and one thing led to another, and she moved on from Spokane and started dancing in Seattle, Washington, and then from there in Victoria, British Columbia. And at this point in time, the Klondike Gold Rush began. And this was the major gold stampede up into the Yukon Territory. This brought, maybe 100,000 people tried to make that a goal, to make it all the way up to the Klondike and try to strike it rich. And Kate heard about this. There was a lot of stories coming into the West Coast ports about the wealth that was found up in the Klondike. And when the first ship arrived out of the Klondike into Seattle, they had about $1 billion in today's money in gold just on that first boat alone. So it was an enormous strike, and a lot of people obviously wanted to get up there and try to take part in that. And a lot of these guys that were going up there also needed to be entertained. So Kate joined up with what was called the Savoy Theatrical Company, who was going to descend in mass on Dawson City and entertain these miners. So Dawson City had grown from a town of just a few hundred people to thousands of people in a year. So it was just booming at its edges. And Kate and company descended with the Savoy Theatrical Company. They showed up in town. They started doing performances, and Kate really quickly became sort of the star of the show. She was an incredibly vivacious woman, a great dancer and a great singer, and a great listener as well. And that was one of the things that people always commented on about her as she participated in the gold strike and the Yukon, that she was always listening to folks. She would listen to miners tell their tales of woe, and she'd try to cheer up their spirits to get them going again. And in addition to that, she had her signature dance, which was called the Flame Dance. And at one point in time, as she was dancing around on the stages there, she could elevate a few hundred yards of red chiffon behind her. So you can imagine that'd be quite the sight, especially for a bunch of lonely men. And then lonely men are the guys that show up at a place like that, trying to make their money. So Kate,
And this is in about 1900.
That's right.
And I believe by an article it was in the bulletin earlier this week that she was making a phenomenal amount of money even by today's standards at that time.
Exactly. She was making around $500 to $700 a night in $1,900 money, right? So by modern standards, that's about, I think, $15,000, $16,000 sometimes in a given night. I mean, it's just an incredible amount of cash was. Well, not cash, gold. Gold dust, gold nuggets was flowing around up there. And Kate certainly took in her share and became independently wealthy for quite a time up there in the Klondike. But she fell in love. She made the mistake eventually of falling in love. She'd turned down countless proposals. She was pretty much turning down, 5 to 6 proposals a night for marriage. But one guy did strike her fancy, and this fellow's name was Alexander Pantages. And as a contrast with all these sort of dirty miners with their long beards and so on, Alex was this young Greek, clean-shaven, tall, dark, swarthy kind of guy. And she fell for him hard, and they lived together out of wedlock in the Klondike, and then eventually left the Klondike together, heading down to Seattle. And I think we're heading into our break soon, but after we come back, I'll talk about how Kate moved on from Seattle to Central Oregon here.
Well, but he did break her heart.
Yes, yeah, the heartbreak is coming up.
Okay, well, we'll look forward to that after the break. And thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll talk to you after the break. Well, welcome back. We're listening to Talk Real Estate with Fred Johnson. I'm your host, Fred Johnson. Today here in the studio, we have Nate Pedersen. Nate Pedersen is a community librarian with Deschutes Public Library, as well as president of the board of directors for the Deschutes Historical Society. We're really happy to have him. He's telling us a little story today about Klondike Kate. Some of you that have lived in Bend for a number of years may remember Klondike Kate and Klondike Kate's house down at 231 Franklin Street. She was really quite a character here in Bend for a number of years, and we're really honored to be able to have this opportunity to tell her story today. So you can always contact Nate at Nate Pedersen. That's PEDERSEN.com. And there's some information about interesting historical tidbits and all of that. So before the break, Nate, you basically brought us through Kate's younger life and got her right to the point to where she was about to incur the heartbreak of a lifetime.
That's right. Yep. So where we left off, she was in Seattle with Alex Pantages, who was beginning a theatrical chain that would eventually become a national chain called Pantages Theaters. And there's still some Pantages Theaters around today, including one in Los Angeles. And Kate, who was still vaudeville dancing at the time, would travel around the country and send money back to Alex to help start this burgeoning theatrical empire. She danced in Galveston, Texas during an oil boom, for example, and would send a lot of her proceeds back to Seattle. And then one night when she was dancing in Spokane, a letter arrived from a friend with the news that Alex had abruptly married a 17-year-old violinist. So
wow,
that was the end of the road for their relationship. Although
I gather no more money was sent back.
Right, no more money was sent back. That ended that part of that relationship for sure. But Kate, had fallen in love with Alex, and for her that was something that was for life. And so she always still loved Alex, even though he treated her, pretty awfully, as you can tell by that incident there. So she was brokenhearted after that and wasn't quite sure what to do. She did file a breach of contract suit up in Seattle and King County in Washington State there for a breach of promise to marry. Since they had been living together out of wedlock and so on, she had a bit of a case there that was settled out of court for an undisclosed amount of cash. But that cash gave her a little bit of money, a little bit of freedom to stop with the vaudeville circuit for a while and kind of figure out what she wanted to do next in life. And around that same point in time, she saw a travelogue, which were these little films they'd show in the early days of motion pictures that would just advertise moving to a region. And at that point in time, Bend and Central Oregon more broadly was sort of one of the last great places you could go in Homestead and kind of experience the last bit of the West in that sense. So Kate thought it looked pretty cool. So this
is about maybe 1910, 1912, somewhere in that range?
Yep, that's right. Yep, exactly. And she bought herself a six-shooter and a horse and took off alone from Seattle to wander her way down south to Central Oregon on a very leisurely route. And she eventually showed up in Central Oregon and liked it a lot. She really liked Bend, which was bursting at the seams at that point in time with a lot of interesting characters, and wanted to figure out a way to come back more permanently. So she returned to Seattle to kind of sort out what she was going to do next. And I know this is a real estate show, so I think your listeners might appreciate this story. Her mother at that point in time was running a real estate office in Seattle, and a fellow showed up that said, I've got this homestead claim out near Brothers, Oregon, and I want to swap that out. I want to get rid of it I want to instead get some waterfront property in Seattle.
Wow.
And Kate's mother knew that Kate had been looking for an opportunity to move to Central Oregon and brought her in on this deal, and she threw some money in, and this guy made a swap on property, and Kate ended up with a 320-acre homestead out by Brothers, and this guy ends up with some waterfront property in Seattle. So you can ask who got the better end of that deal. If you've never seen Brothers, Oregon, look it up. It's out there in the desert.
Brothers never grew that much.
Right. No, it never did. Although, and one of those kind of funny things, it was more populated in that era than it was, today, or than it is today. So Kate left Seattle again, and this time to become a homesteader out by Brothers. She had a 320-acre homestead in the desert, so 3 miles from Brothers, about 40 miles from Bend here. And she showed up there famously in her high heels and her dresses, and was, improving the homestead, which is the requirement in order to gain the title to the property. You'd have to prove up on the claim. And pretty quickly she became, the talk of Central Oregon, and she got with a much younger man. The first actual marriage of her life, she got with a young cowboy named Floyd Warner, who was 19 years younger than she was. So she was 39 at the time that she moved here to Central Oregon, and she married a 20-year-old cowboy. And they managed to get the claim to their property. They proved up on that homestead claim out there by Brothers.
So she'd already had a rich and full life by the time she arrived in Central Oregon in the early teens.
Absolutely. Yep. And, and in a way, too, she was just getting started. All of Kate's life was interesting. She always had a great sensitivity toward adventure, and wanderlust, and she was always doing interesting things. So she married this guy. It was a short-lived marriage. She went off to fight in World War I, and when he came back, she was living in Prineville at the time, and they operated a small cafe in Prineville for just about a year before their marriage fell apart and they got divorced. And that's when Kate finally moves here to Bend, and she gathers together a little bit of money, and she moves to a house at 231 Franklin Street. That's no longer standing, but that's right across the street from where St. Charles Hospital used to be, downtown there. Mm-hmm. And she had a house there that she had remodeled to kind of resemble a Klondike cabin. And famously, a famous part of that house that we'll talk a little bit more about later on today too was a huge chimney that was built out of her rock collection. So Kate was also, amongst many other interests and hobbies throughout her life, she was Central Oregon, or Oregon in general's first serious rock hound. And she became, when she was a homesteader, she became a pretty serious collector of rocks, and had amassed a pretty significant rock collection. In those days, it was a little bit easier than it is today to be a rock hound. You could kind of walk around and just throw some rocks in the back of your wagon, and they're probably pretty good rocks,
Mm-hmm.
And so she'd built up this massive collection that became this chimney. A lot of it became this chimney at her house on Franklin Street, and then some of it she also used, some old-timers in Bend might remember this, but she also used for rock art in her front lawn. She'd make kind of swirling patterns of rock art. So I know we'll get a little bit more into that later on. But Kate settled into her life here in Bend. She developed a friendly and long-term relationship with the Bend Fire Department, which Fred alluded to earlier in the program. One of Kate's affectionate nicknames around town was Aunt Kate, and a lot of that came out of the way she'd help out at fires. So one cold winter night, seemingly on a whim, she heard the fire trucks take off, and at that point in time, the fire station in Bend wasn't very far away from her house, about 2 blocks. And it was cold out, and it was late at night, and she thought maybe she could help out these guys. So she hopped in her jalopy after making up some coffee and making up some sandwiches, and she followed those sirens out to this fire and distributed coffee and sandwiches to the gentlemen that she would affectionately call her boys with the Bend Fire Department. And that relationship continued for years. So Kate was sort of a fixture at local fires for many years. If there was a fire in Bend, you could expect to see Kate there helping out in whatever way she could. And in return, the Bend Fire Department would help Kate with any sort of projects she needed help with around her house, any house repairs. If she needed transportation somewhere, they'd help with that. And they also brought in 2 petrified stumps that are now today in Drake Park, but 2 petrified stumps that were on her homestead claim up by Brothers. The high wind out there one day blew the desert sand away, revealing these ancient petrified stumps, and she, as a rock hound, thought those were pretty cool. And at one point in time, the Bend Fire Department went out to the desert and brought in these stumps, and they put them up at the fire department when it was downtown. And after the fire department eventually moved, the stumps were gifted onto the city of Bend, who installed them in Drake Park. And there's not a sign by them at the moment, although we've been in talk with Bend Park and Rec about getting a sign put in place. But if you're walking kind of near the bathrooms in Drake Park today, if you look off to your right, if you're kind of facing the bathrooms, you might see 2 low stumps, and those stumps are Kate's stumps. They're from her homestead claim up by Brothers. So
that's absolutely remarkable. I first moved to Bend in the fall of '76, so it's been a number of years ago. And even when I first came to town, that was acknowledged as Kate's place. That was Klondike Kate's house. It was still standing at the time. And the stories that you would hear on the street about Klondike Kate and what a character and what a big part of the city of Bend she was at that time. This is absolutely remarkable for you to share the story with us today. We really, really appreciate it.
Well, thanks
so much, Nate. After we come back from the break, we'll continue on with Nate a little bit more. We'll kind of talk about, we've sort of hinted at the fireplace and the stones and all of the things that are going there, the legacy of Klondike Kate and what that looks like moving forward. You can always contact Nate at natepedersen.com. He spells his last name Pedersen. So that's natepedersen.com. You can always contact me direct at fred@dukewarner.com or call us here at the station at 541-388-1110. So when we come back, we'll talk a little bit about the future. We'll talk a little bit about the legacy of Klondike Kate, and hopefully you'll tune in at that time. Thank you so much. Well, hello there, Central Oregon, and welcome back. You're with Talk Real Estate. I'm your host, Fred Johnson. I'm here today with Nate Pedersen. Nate Pedersen is a community librarian with the Deschutes Public Library, as well as the president of the board of directors for the Deschutes Historical Society. And Nate is here sharing today the story of Klondike Kate. And so far, we've brought Klondike Kate through her youth to Central Oregon, to part of her life in Central Oregon, and then now we're about to move on into her legacy and what happened with her property and all of that. And one of the things that I just really like to thank Nate, again, you can contact Nate at natepedersen.com, and that's Pedersen, is one of the quotes in this week's paper is how did it go? There's nothing more powerful than having history come to life, and this history is part of Central Oregon and very much part of who we are here in Central Oregon. And I just wanted to thank Nate for coming in and sharing Klondike Kate's story with us today.
Well, thanks again for having me, Fred. It's been fun talking about Kate. It's always fun talking about Kate, and she's led such an interesting life. It's an easy one to share with other people.
It sounds that she had a flamboyant life and, made money, lost money, felt love and lost love.
Absolutely. Yep. A roller coaster in both ways, in and out of money, in and out of love. And on that love note, well, she was living here in Bend. She got married again. So the last marriage we talked about on the show was when she was with that younger cowboy, and they got divorced in the early 20s. And then shortly after that, Kate got with a aging miner who was still up in the Klondike, that was still trying to strike a claim up there in the Klondike. And he wrote a letter to Kate. He'd found out that Kate was living in Bend at the time, and he was a shy guy. It took a little while for him to summon up his courage, but after kind of mulling it over for a while, he wrote off a letter to Kate addressed to her here in Bend and hoping that it would arrive. And it was a bit of a love letter, just saying, I remember you, when you were dancing around 1900 in the Klondike, and I used to come and watch you every night. I was the guy that was quiet, didn't say anything in the back of the bar, And the letter made it here and sort of made its way to Bend eventually, and Kate read it and was very touched by it. And she dimly recalled this guy. This is a Swedish guy named Mattsson. And she dimly recalled his presence, in the back of the bar while she was dancing and so on. And she wrote back, and they started up a correspondence over letters, and eventually agreed to meet in Vancouver, British Columbia, and they met there and hit it off and decided to get married. And so they did. They got married, and then
wow.
Maybe this is one of the keys to a successful marriage, but they only spent 2 weeks a year together. they would part ways for the vast majority of the year, and Kate would resume her life here in Bend, Oregon, and he would head back up into the Klondike, keeping on looking for gold, and he'd send furs and he'd send gold and that kind of thing back down to Kate here in Bend. And then eventually, in the 40s, Kate wrote a letter to him as winter was coming on, saying you should really consider, leaving the Klondike. And this guy was older than Kate; he was in his 80s by that point, and you should come live here in Bend and get out of the cold. And then she never heard back from him, and the whole winter went by. She never got a letter. So in the spring, she traveled her way all the way up into the Klondike again, only to discover that he had died. He died in that winter alone deep in the outback there in his cabin, and his body had been ravaged by wolves after he died of natural causes. So she came back to Bend. One of Kate's quotes in life that I think you can take away is mush on and smile. She was always saying that. She was saying, when life gets you down, you just got to mush on and smile. So not one to grieve for a long period of time over a loss like that. She kind of bounced back from that and got married again shortly thereafter to a local accountant here in Bend, a fellow named Bill Van Duren, who was an accountant and a former boarder. One of the ways Kate made money here in Bend was taking in lodgers at her house on Franklin Street. And this fellow Bill was one of her lodgers at one point in time. And they got married and had a very happy marriage. They were long-term friends, and friendship, of course, is a good foundation for a marriage. And they lived here in Bend for the last little bit of Kate's life until the very end. And in the last 2 years of her life, in the mid-50s, they left Bend and moved over to Sweet Home, Oregon. They moved over to the Valley, and that's where Kate ended up dying in 1957.
1957. How long did that last marriage last? Say 10 years or so? Or
right about 10 years. Yep, exactly. That last marriage. And so Kate didn't have any heirs per se, and so the house sort of sat around here in Bend, the house on Franklin Street. And I'm not sure yet on what the chain of ownership was on that house following Kate's death, but at any point in time, if we fast forward a couple decades, by the mid-'80s, it was pretty much a derelict place there on Franklin Street. And some local brothers in development purchased the property, hoping to install something commercial there. And the house was offered for a long time to anyone that was willing to move it. It was basically, you can have the house for free. We just need it off of this.
Oh, I remember that. Obviously, I was in real estate in 1979. So during that time, that Kate's place was always available, and it was always acknowledged as that place that had the great rock fireplace in it.
Oh, right. Oh, that's interesting to know. Yeah, so, then the Historical Society made some efforts to try to come up with some money to have it moved, and it just didn't work out. Bend in the mid-'80s was in the midst of a much worse recession than the one we all just went through.
Interest rates were at 19%.
Is that right?
That's right.
Wow. So there just wasn't money floating around, to do stuff like that. And historic preservation, while important in the 80s, wasn't perhaps as important as it is to us today. Like, it hadn't quite sunk into the consciousness as much as I think we all feel now an obligation to preserve history in a way we maybe didn't as much back then. So unfortunately, the house then was bulldozed in around 1985. And for a long time, there was a mystery over what happened next, over what happened to the rocks. And as it turns out, the brothers that had purchased the place, who had recognized the historic value of it and had long hoped that something of that house could be preserved, decided to just take in the rocks, themselves, and hope that eventually they could figure out a way to have that used in some kind of memorial to Kate. And so the rocks went with the brothers, but everyone kind of lost track of the trail of the rocks for a number of years, and then suddenly 30 years later they popped up on Craigslist of all places, and they were offering the rocks up for sale on Craigslist. And a rock hound up in northern Oregon, up on the Columbia River there, a little town called Corbett. There's a great guy up there named Chuck Rollins, who is a rock hound and the president of their local historical society, and he saw the advertisement on Craigslist and knew that Kate was this famous rock collector at one point, and so he got really excited about that. And we got some money together and went down and got 6,000 pounds of Kate's rocks. And,
wow.
He paid a certain amount of money, and the brothers donated the rest of the rocks to him and his society. And then they hauled 6,000 pounds of rocks out of Central Oregon and up to Corbett area, where they had plans to install a memorial wall. And a couple of years go by, and I started doing my own research into Kate and development of a history pub talk for McMenamins that I gave back in January. And found out about this guy named Chuck, and he also was doing some Klondike Kate history talks up in the Portland area. So we connected up one day, and I asked him, one of the mysteries of Kate is whatever happened to this massive rock collection she had here. And he kind of laughed and just said, "Well, I've got them in my backyard." So,
well, there's another interesting historical, and I'm certain that you're well aware of it, but the fireplace that was in the old Pilot Butte Hotel.
Right.
And when that was taken down, they put it in storage, and it's now in the Athletic Club of Bend in the restaurant there. So,
right, yeah, exactly.
That one was reused as a fireplace again. Well, Nate, I want to thank you very much, and thank you again for coming in and talking with us today, and sharing a little bit of history with our listeners and talking about real estate.
Absolutely.
And again, this is Nate Pedersen, Pedersen, and Nate is a community librarian with the Deschutes Public Library. if you have any historic interest in Bend, and in future shows, we'll ask some historic questions to see if we can elicit some phone calls from some of you listeners out there. Again, thank you, Nate. And thank you, listeners, for tuning in. You can always contact me, Fred, at DukeWarner.com. And until next week, be safe, make memories.